Good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. It's a pleasure to receive here in our first version of webinar about philosophy of mathematics. I want only to say some words before. I would like to thank you, all the team of researcher group of origin of Contemporânea philosophy from Pontifícia Universidade Católica of São Paulo and the Department of Philosophy of Unicentro, Paraná. And in particular, I would like to thank my colleagues, Julia, Frank Hengin, Ernesto Maria Giusti, and Arthur Heller Brito, and our colleague from University Católica of São Paulo, Arthur. Thank you very much and enjoy our program.
Okay, thank you, Evandro. I would like now to introduce Professor Julia Frank Hedig, who has a postdoc position in University of Siegen and a postdoc position in the University of Geneva. She's going to be presenting now her talk. We will be having each presentation followed by a question session, beginning with questions from our speakers and then questions from our online audience. Julia, thank you for being here. You may begin.
So thank you too for the opportunity to submit my paper and to present it here today. I'm really glad for this. So today I don't have much slides. Most of the time you will just see this overview over the topics I'm talking about. I just have some slides for the third point, the principle of reduction, the fourth point, but you will see that. So first, because I thought Moritz Schlick is not a very well-known philosopher, I would first like to give the historical and philosophical background, and because I'm talking about Mach's influence on Schlick, I'm focusing in this historical background on his connections or relations to Machian philosophy during his career. Most people do know Moritz Schlick as the founder and integrational figure of the Vienna Circle. But before he became those founder, or even before he became a philosopher, it's interesting to see that he first studied physics under Max Planck. And later on, he reflected that he hasn't been studying physics out of a physical interest, but always out of a philosophical interest. And so after his dissertation, he stopped doing physics in this special way and started to study psychology and philosophy. And so after a few years of struggle, he managed to do his habilitation at the University of Rostock in 1911. So he remained there until 1921, till he went to the University of Kiel, but there he only stayed for 1 year, and then the phase of the Vienna Circle slowly began when he got the chair previously held by Ernst Mach at the University of Vienna. And here's a point I'm going to talk about: an early and a late Schlick. And the cut can be made here. For this, we can discuss a lot about when does the early Schlick end and when does the late Schlick begin. But at this point, and or in this in the context I'm talking about today, we can make a clear cut in 1921. So every text I'm talking about that is from 1921 or earlier, then I'm talking about the early Schlick. And when I'm talking about the late Schlick, I'm always talking about the Vienna Schlick. And so what is this about the early and the late Schlick? Mostly when we are talking about or asking about Schlick's philosophical standpoint, most philosophers or interpreters say that this early Schlick, this Rostock Schlick, has had the position of a critical realism, and that the late Schlick had a more positivist position, and some authors even say that the positivist philosophy or the whole philosophy of the early Schlick doesn't have to do anything with the late Schlick. So Matthias Neubauer from Austria and from Germany is here talking about Schlick doing a U-turn in 1921, 1922. But if we look, what did Schlick say himself about his philosophy? So in 1931, he wrote a self-description. And this I want to citate for you. Schlick holds that previous forms of empiricism, from Sextus Empiricus to Mill and Mach, were neither pure nor consequent, because they could not provide a satisfactory account of logic and mathematics, the rational. However, Schlick's new empiricism precisely starts from the understanding of mathematical thinking and its application to reality. And here I think are two important points. First, he doesn't see a cut in his philosophical development. He doesn't make a differentiation between his early and late philosophy himself. This is always just described to him. And the second thing that we can see here is that it's evident that Schlick saw himself as following a tradition in which Ernst Mach played a significant role. And so the examination of Mach's work permeated his entire career. And this is something I want to talk about today. So on the surface, one might assume that the early Schlick, as a critical realist, rejected Mach's standpoint, while those late Schlick supported it. So Friedrich Stadler from Vienna, and I think 3 years ago, he published his paper on Mach's influence on the Vienna Circle. And there he pointed out that Schlick's early critique of Mach obviously arose under the influence of Max Planck, and that the later Schlick, not made a U-turn in this point, but changed his mind on Mach under the influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Rudolf Carnap. But I think Stadler's paper is really interesting, and I like it, and it holds a lot of interesting points. But one thing is that Stadler here only considers his Schlick's first major work, the General Theory of Knowledge from 1918, and later writings. And so my idea in this paper was to supplement Stadler's argumentation regarding Schlick's earlier writings, especially those that have recently been published from his estate, and making remarks on what should we do research on in the future for a better understanding of Mach's influence on especially Schlick. And so this and this is my thesis, could give us a broader view of the development of Schlick's position on Mach's philosophy, and that maybe in the a second thesis, but that's more beneath, is that here we have another point that we can see that those differentiation between those early and this late Schlick is too superficial and is not so easy to just say that that the late Schlick was the founder of the Vienna Circle and at this point influenced the rising of analytical philosophy, and the critical realism of the early Schlick doesn't have to do anything with this. So this would be my counterpart. So, and in this aim, I would like to point out the thesis that the early Schlick did not only deny Mach, but was also influenced by him. And so I have three different facets on the influence of Mach on Schlick. So the first is the first facet of this influence is lies or can be seen in Schlick's rejection of Mach's positivism. The second, and this is a more historical point, is the background of Schlick's interpretation of the theories of relativity, and the last point is lying in Schlick's principle of reduction. So I see. Okay, I have to look for my time. 30 minutes in total, right?
Yes, Julia, 30 minutes.
Okay. So let's come to the first point, Schlick's rejection of Mach's positivism. What Staller already pointed out in the paper I was already talking about is or has been Schlick's clear demarcation from Mach inside his general theory of knowledge from 1918. So especially in his critiques of the immanence thoughts. So what does that mean? For Schlick, Mach was the philosopher of immanence per se. What he means with this is that Mach's position is a dogmatic position that holds the identity of the real with the given. And so he's employing this this Machian position to outline his own philosophical standpoint as a middle or something in the middle that is lying between the philosophy of immanence of Mach on the one side and the Kantian transcendental philosophy as its counterpart on the other side. So he's rejecting the Machian dogma while simultaneously negating the unknowability of things in themselves. So he designates things in themselves as objects that are real but not given, and at the same time identifies them as knowable. And so this is a very good example of how a philosopher can be influenced by philosophical ideas without entirely subscribing to them. So the impact here lies in the self-demarcation. And so by rejecting Mach's viewpoint, which, as Schlick asserts, only considers the actual given as real, and the Kantian thesis that things in themselves are unknowable, he acknowledges both philosophers' perspectives. And so here the Machian influence lies in those acts of delineation. So I'm sorry. So if we look at the Schlick's general theory of knowledge, then we can see which are the philosophers that he's commenting mostly on. And these philosophers are, in fact, Immanuel Kant and Ernst Mach. So one might assume that both of these philosophers are the most important philosophers to him. So, and because of this, they are more, he's commenting more on them, much more extensive compared to other philosophers. So the question is, why are they so important to him? And I think that the reason for this is that Schlegel sees their connection to the sciences. So, and there I found a very interesting comment from 1910, 1911. So before, so I'm talking about Schlegel's really, really early writings that have just recently been published. 1910 is before he did his habilitation. So he was a really young researcher at this time. And here he states that the most significant aspect of Kantian epistemology was the examination of exact scientific thinking through philosophy, stating that the same applies no matter how different the task is solved of Mach's epistemology. And so in a later writing from 1915, also really early writing, he states that beneath the Kantian, no other contemporary philosophical movement is connected as closely to exact sciences as positivism, and subsequently he's discussing Mach. So for him, Schlegel has been a philosopher at that point, but he came from physics, so he was a scientist. And what he always aimed to do was to develop a philosophy that truly gives justice to scientific practice. And so he's seen that the most important, or from his point of view, the most important philosophers that engaged with sciences, from his point of view, were Kant and Mach. And so I see I'm already running out of time. Yes, I skipped the next point. And so we have also his recently published sample lectures from 1909, 1910. So also really early writings where he's talking about idealism and its refutation. And here we can find his, I think, maybe one of his first comments on Mach. And here he is also talking about Mach's, or the dogmatic character of Machian philosophy, but he further adds that Mach is unable to avoid the presumption of the transcendental, the principle which only allows us to consider the directly given and does not permit any transcendental assumption, would lead to solipsism. So afterwards he states that in his, or in Mach's efforts to save himself from this, he falls into metaphysical idealism and is unable to remain true to his own critical intentions and premises. What does that mean? So the word transcendent or transcendental is here by Schlegel not used in a Kantian sense. So for Schlegel, transcendent or to transcend, he's using this term to signify, assuming something beyond the given or presuming entities not given as real. And so here at this early point, we can find preparatory considerations for Schlegel's conception of things in themselves within the GTR already at this earlier point, very early point of his career. And as we can see also, he is formulating these preparatory considerations in his examination of Machian philosophy, even at this early point of his career. And of course, we can say it's he does reject Mach, but as I told before, he in this rejection always lies demarcation or delineation. and this is the way influence we can see here, and that was also marked by Stadler. But what I wanted to point out here is that this didn't only happen in 1918 or later going for the Vienna Schlick going. It already happened in his very early career. So we can see that Schlick worked his philosophical way through Mach during his whole philosophical career, and did not start with it when he came to Vienna, as often told. So yeah, I would have another point here, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip this. So the point here is the influence of Mach on the early Schlick is much bigger than mostly told, especially from philosophers that only take into account the Vienna Schlick. So the next point, Schlick's interpretation of the theories of relativity. It's a really historical point, and so at this I plan to just give to you. So here I with the during the last years, Finn Ole Engler from the University of Rostock published the correspondence between Einstein and Schlick, and he also published other works from Schlick regarding the philosophy of relativity. And here with the help of Engler's work, I reconstructed how Schlick and Einstein got to know each other. And here my point was just to argument that or in the story of how they got to know each other, we can see that if Schlick wouldn't have read or examined Machian philosophy closely, I think that it's highly speculative, but I think that if that wouldn't have happened, then Einstein and Schlick would never have got to know each other in the way they got to know each other. So as from a historical standpoint, we know that the acquaintanceship with Einstein was very important for Schlick's philosophical career and for his philosophical background. And we can see here that if Schlick hadn't read Mach that in that intense way, it would never have happened that he got in touch with Einstein, who was a Machianist at this time. Einstein himself implemented the Machian principle into his own theory. If Schlick hadn't examined Mach that closely, those dialogue between Moritz Schlick and Albert Einstein, as we know it today, would never have happened. So that's here the mostly historical point that I was talking about in this chapter. And now I am going to talk about the principle of reduction. And here I need my second slide. So this is somehow to explain a very central concept of Schlick's mathematical philosophy of knowledge. In his general theory of knowledge, Schlick is developing so-called systems of concepts. So he states that, or he notes that, a scientific theory is always a connection of knowledge. And this connection is to be expressed by a system built up by concepts. On those concepts, which are connected to those concepts are always connected to each other by judgments. And so each individual concept within such a complex conceptual system is to be understood as a sign for an object of reality, while the objects of reality are in turn connected to one another by facts. So the judgments of the system represent signs for those facts, and in the whole, the system of concepts are signs of the complex factual connections of reality. And this is what this picture shall show here. I hope it's better to understand if what I mean, if you can see this conception here in such an more intuitive way. And so with this, that's an interesting point, I think. Schlick is so I need the last slide now. Thank you. So with this, Schlick is inspired by David Hilbert's axiomatization of geometry from 1899, especially in his use of the implicit definition. So here at the highest x 1, 2, 3 here can be understood as an axiom of the system, and it's defined implicit, while the concepts x1, x2, and x3 from the lowest step are defined by concrete definitions, and all the higher level concepts are defined by implicit definitions. And so so these implicit defined concepts encompass all concepts at the lower levels, which means that the concepts from the lower steps of the system can be derived from the higher level concepts. And so in such a system, from bottom to top, we progress from special to general concepts. And we do this by using our capacity of knowledge. And so this is the way Schlick is trying to make a mathematical reconstruction of scientific knowledge and of scientific theories in general. So these considerations have been central in Schlick's early and as well as in his later works. And within this context, we can find at least hints of Machian philosophy. And so the central aspect of these, or one central aspect of these systems of concepts lies in a rule he gives to them. And this rule states that as we move from downward to upward within such a system, the number of concepts has to be reduced for each step. Stadler, in his already cited paper, pointed out that with this assumption, or with assumptions like that, Schlick already formulated the principle of economy according to the characterization in the Manifesto of the Vienna Circle from 1929. But as I pointed out here, we can already find this not only in his Space and Time in Contemporary Physics was a philosophical interpretation of the theory of relativity and was a bit later, but we can already find this within his general theory of knowledge. There he writes, for example, I'm going to cite this: the way described, the number of appearances explained by the same principle is continually increasing, and consequently, the number of principles necessary to explain the totality of appearances is decreasing. So, of course, Schlick is here denying Mach's principle of economy in the general theory of knowledge. He's also the late Schlick is doing this. Schlick is, I think, also in his writings from the 1930s, he did this. But nevertheless, at this point in 1918, he admitted that here's the last citation. There is a correct core underlying it. and the reader of the preceding chapters cannot doubt what he is looking for. Knowledge consists of designating things in the world completely and unambiguously through a minimum of concepts, economizing with the smallest possible number of basic concepts. Therein lies the economy of sciences. And so with this, he directly connects the Machian concept with a central aspect of his own philosophy of science. And this passage was already contained within the 1918 edition of the GTR. And so within the writings of the so-called early Schlick, we cannot just find demarcation, but also alignment to Machian philosophy. And we can also find this in his first lecture at the University of Rostock. Here I would have some other examples for this, but I'm going to skip this and get going to finish with my conclusion. So I hope I have explained here that we have the influence of Mach on Schlick is mostly reduced on the late Schlick, but I hope to have shown here that there might lie some influence also in his earliest writings, and that we have to go on researching on this in the future. It is not possible to do it conclusively right now, because at this time we are still waiting for the publication of important writings of Schlick by the Millard Schlick Research Center in Rostock. So including his forthcoming including some forthcoming editions, and especially Schlick's scientific correspondence. So nonetheless, I hope to have revealed here that further investigations, particularly into Schlick's early writings, hold the promise of providing new insights into the philosophical development of the founder of the Vienna Circle, and consequently into the evolution of analytical philosophy in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We'll now be opening to questions from our participants here in the fourth seminars on the origins of contemporary philosophy. Does any of the researchers present have any questions?
Maybe before the question, it is possible I'd like to hear about Julia, a little comment in the follow point. May I ask you right now?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. In your paper, Julia, you said that Schlick dismissed the Kantian concept of thinking themselves and redefined it by asserting his own perspective. You said that Schlick designates those objects as real but not given, and unequivocally and define them as knowable.
Yeah.
Could you comment a little more on the cognizable nature of the real object in the light of German conceptual distinctions, Realität and Wirklichkeit? There are some relation.
It's a really big topic. I wrote in my dissertation on this question of reality. It's the longest chapter of my dissertation, and it's a really big question how Schlick is understanding reality, or if how the realism of the early Schlick is to understand and to be connected to his positivist position during his Vienna time. But one very central aspect of this is his new definition of things in themselves. And he really states that they are, as you pointed out, they are objects that are we mark as real, but as well also if they were not given. So and it's a big question, what objects can be understood by this. I think every object in the world of that a physicist would say that this was real. For example, the chair that you cannot see here standing beneath my table, as well as my cup of coffee, as well as atoms. Every, you know what I mean? Every thing that a physicist would mark as real, this is real for Schlick. And if we are not able to perceive those things, maybe because the chair is standing in the room beneath, or maybe because atoms are too small to perceive them directly, all those things for Schlick are things in themselves. And so this is one central aspect of his conception of reality, but it's really much more complicated, and I would need to give another talk to explain his conception of reality as a whole. But I hope to have answered your question a bit.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, if I could ask a question, it's kind of related to this. I was thinking, I have a lot of sympathies for critical realism and this kind of philosophical position on epistemology, and it's interesting to have this idea of an object that is real but not given, but I feel that this distinction comes with a requirement to understand how is it that we can know objects that are not given to us. And since I don't know Schlick very much, I would love if you could talk a little bit about how he deals with this.
Okay, so for Schlick is very important his distinction between the best translation would be between knowing and knowing. The German differentiation is canon and erkennen. You know what I mean? So he has a very central, that's also a very central aspect in his philosophy of sciences that he already pointed out in his earliest writings, and that he's also talking about in his latest writings. So how can we know things that are not given? So my question would be, knowing in which sense do you mean here? So we can, on the one side, in Schlick's words, on the one side, we can know things, or the one way of knowing for Schlick is to perceiving them. Then we know them maybe in the sense of we have there are so many German words to describe this those distinction. I'm missing English words for this. We have so the first way of knowing is connected to living. It's if you have perceived something, if you have lived through something, if you have really felt or perceived it through your senses. This is the one way of knowing. But then there's connected to this way of knowing, there's also something like yesterday someone pointed to a table and said, this is a table, now I know this is a table. So just this way of knowing as a way of not understanding something, but just knowing that there's a connection of one word to something in the world. So this is knowledge in the sense of canon in Schlick's philosophy. And the other, that's the more interesting way of knowledge is the one translation might be knowledge as recognition, and this is more complicated and also connected to those systems of concepts. So every time that within those systems of concepts, you see a lot of relations, and every time that I connect two concepts to each other, or every time that there is a that I recognize that there is a connection between two concepts that I didn't know before. This is somehow recognition for him, and this is the way real scientific knowledge arises for Schlick. You understand what I mean? And so there are, so to come back to your question was how can I know things that I did not perceive? Within those systems of concepts, we have different ways to go from one step to another, and these different ways are maybe different kinds of recognition or of recognition-based knowledge. There are several ways, and I would need more time to discuss all those ways on how this works within Schlick's philosophy. But it's always connected to those axiomatic systems. Yes, I'm sorry, I cannot answer the question as a whole, because it would take me much more time.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. It was just to hear a little bit about it, because I don't know much about it.
Okay.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question from Professor Ernesto. Thank you.
Hello, Julia. Thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot. I haven't read much Schlick, but I've been reading French philosophy of mathematics and Poincaré, and many commentators of Poincaré point a similarity between Poincaré, conventionalist philosophy of geometry especially, and Schlick. Also pointed to some differences. He's not, I would say Schlick seems to be more, less empiricist than Poincaré was in some aspects. And maybe taking up the question of Arthur, the question from Arthur before, I think, is there an influence, a direct influence of Poincaré in Schlick? And because one thing that Poincaré does in his philosophy of geometry is to allow what could be called objects that are real, but not perceived, not wirklich, because he defines objects in terms of their relations, and geometry is about those relationships between objects in Poincaré. Could you say some words about this?
So there is an influence, but especially in his interpretation of the theory of relativity. And I think so. He first wrote the general theory of knowledge, and there we find those systems of concepts and those conception of things in themselves. But here I think he is commenting on Poincaré, but not so much. After he published it, he got to know Einstein, and Einstein, I think Einstein, it was Einstein's influence who led Schlick to more read and more comment on Poincaré. So we can find these comments, but in his mostly connected with his interpretation of theory of relativity.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so if there are no more questions from our researchers, let's see if there are any questions from the audience, but I think we actually don't have time for any more questions. I'm sorry. So thank you, Julia. Thank you for your presentation. Just going to remove it here. And now we're going to continue with a talk by Professor Ernesto from the State University of the Midwest. Thank you, Professor, for being here with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I will talk about Louis Couturat and the French battle for logicism. Going to the paper. Opening his 1906 Les Principes des Mathématiques, Couturat writes, "The number and variety of these, what he calls logical, and after these logistic works, the number of and variety of these logistic works that appear in Italy, in England, in Germany, and in America proves to the most superficial spectator the unending progress made by logistics and the logic of mathematics. We are sorry to observe that France took no part in it." That's written in 1906. Okay, Couturat will dedicate most of his life work to change this state of affairs, introducing what he calls logistics into French philosophy, and then establishing what I call a battle for logicism. But we will see that his logistique is not quite the same thing as Fregean or especially Russellian and Peano's logicism. So it will be his life work to change the state of affairs, conducting an enthusiastic campaign for what he calls first la logique symbolique, symbolic logic, and finally la logistique, and what could be assimilated to an approximation of the logicist program. This battle, it must be said, will be a failure, and these failures will leave a mark in the posterior development of French philosophy. What's my goal with this paper? I want to present and assess the role of Louis Couturat in the history of French philosophy of mathematics and French philosophy in general. And this must be viewed as the papers I presented in the last two meetings of our group, of our research group, as part of a major inquiry into the ways in which the path of French philosophy diverged but also ran parallel to other European philosophical tendencies at the turn of the century, last quarter of 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. I like to say, only half jokingly, that this is an inquiry into the ways in which French philosophy became so French. And for this, I will divide my presentation in two parts. First, I will draft the context of French philosophy, and in particular in its relations to mathematics and science in the last quarter of the 19th century. And secondly, I will present the evolution of Couturat's thought by examining his major works and the issues therein, also pointing to some of the polemical writings of 1906, 1905, and 1906, the last period of intense activity by Couturat, before he decided to abandon philosophy, and dedicate most of his time to campaigning for a new international language, which absorbed him, as he says, chronophagically. It ate his time and stopped almost any other theoretical activity by Couturat. For this, I would like to begin by presenting briefly his life and some dates that will serve as marks for us to understand his development. Couturat was born in Paris in 1868, and he died in 3 August 1914 when he was going in an automobile, in a car to the war front in Milan. So he was one of the first casualties of wars, and also one of the first philosophers to die in an automobile accident. It's a double priority from his. And he studied in Paris in the Lycée Condorcet, and this is not just a biographical bit, but it's important because he was classmate with three other people that were the founders of the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale, which was very important in the development of this period of French philosophy, and also in the development of Couturat and his thought, because almost the most important polemics in which he engaged with Poincaré, with Le Chalat, with Boutroux, were in the pages of the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale, from which he participated from the beginning. Those three were Xavier Léon, Léon Hallevy, and Léon Brunswick. Both they were the four in the same class in high school, and they went just after that to found the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale, from which Couturat always participated. After this, he had a pretty conventional career, development of his career, of his studies in France. He first was made philosophy studies in the École Normale Supérieure, and his jury for the agrégation was presided by Jules Lachelier. So we have a clear link that brings Couturat together with prior tendencies in the French philosophical thought. And he asked and he was allowed in 1991-92 to do an additional year studying mathematics, and this was not usual. He was granted a special permission for this, and he studied under Jules Tannery. Tannery, which you may know as the editor of Descartes, was in fact a mathematician, and he introduced it. He was a champion of Cantor and Dedekind in France. He was the one who translated and introduced Cantorian and Dedekindian thesis in French philosophy of mathematics. In 1983, he begins to collaborate with the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale. And in 3 years after that, in 1986, he gets a double degree in a doctorate in philosophy with a double thesis, as usual, a French thesis and a Latin thesis. His Latin thesis was on the Platonic myths, but for us, it's important his French thesis, which was just after that published as a book, that's called L'Infini Mathématique. And I will present some points of this book soon. In 1901 and 1903, he published his works on Leibniz that were very influential and that dialogued with the contemporary works of both Russell in England and also, as is known, Cassirer in Germany. And finally, his last productive period was in 1905 and 1906, as I said. So we see that's a very brief career if we want to take the published works. It's like 10 years. But in those 10 years, we see a radical change, a radical shift in his positions, and that's what I want to assess here and present here. From 1906 to 1914, as I said, also he dedicated almost his life, all his life and time for campaigning to Esperanto first, and then Ido as an international language for science and communication. He had cosmopolitan and political ideals that he adopted at this time. So let me put some context and background here. Is the first part I want to talk. Like many others of his generation, Couturat used his family fortune to dedicate himself to philosophy without the burden of an academic and bureaucratic position. During his formation, French philosophical life was marked by a strong eclecticism, with many different positions running side by side and concurring side by side, often associated with some authority figures in intellectual history, in intellectual culture, like Comte, like Théodule Ribot, like Charles Renouvier, from which I will speak more, or Boutroux. And I take those 4 names because those are the names he will, for instance, criticize both in the preface of the Infinie Mathématique and in the preface of the Principles of Mathematics, as representing 4 tendencies in French intellectual life in this period. If we should choose only a figure to represent the main current of philosophy in France in the 19th century, it should be, as I defended here in our research group 2 years ago, Renouvier, Charles Renouvier. Renouvier can be viewed as a kind of neo-Kantian, and christened, baptized his own position as neo-criticism. As I said in other occasions, there was not a neo-Kantianism in France, but there was a strong, very strong influence of Kant that derived in the appropriation of Kant or in this kind of neo-criticism of Renouvieran origins. So the term neo-criticism points both to the Kantian influence and to the renewal of the Kantian position. It is important here to understand some tenets of this neo-criticism. Renouvier interpreted Kant very freely and conceived the transcendental method as centered around the transcendental dialectics, not the transcendental analytics of the critique of pure reason, especially the antinomies, as is known. His reading of the antinomies convinced Renouvier to adopt a strongly finitistic stance in mathematics, not only in mathematics, but also in metaphysics. He took the antinomies and considered that the defensible one, the right one, is always the one that takes the finitist path and opts for finitism as guide. Another Kantian stance of his thought was the rejection of the non-Euclidean geometries as mere logical curiosities that do not affect the Euclidean nature of our geometrical space. He accuses what he calls metageometry. He calls the non-Euclidean geometries of Lobachevsky, Riemann, metageometries. He accused these metageometries of empiricism because the final justification of the choice between alternative geometries is expected to be found in experience. He accused metageometries also of contradicting each other and thus leading to mathematical skepticism. And finally, he accused the metageometries of algebraic mysticism, an expression of his, not very clear, but it should be understood as attributing as the kind of move that attributes objective reality to abstract formula in mathematics. Renouvier then fully endorses the Kantian appeal to intuitive, synthetic a priori judgment in justifying mathematics and especially geometry. So we have this permanence of the Kantian model of mathematics and especially the Kantian models of geometry, but with the restriction that it should be viewed finitistically, not infinitistically. These discussions gained particular traction after the publication of the second edition of Renouvier's main work, the Essai de critique générale, essays on general critic, in 1875. The first edition was 20 years earlier, and this second edition renewed the discussion. This date helps us to define the last quarter of the century in French philosophy as one, still very strongly under a Kantian influence in the philosophy of mathematics. That is, using the appeal to intuition as a source of mathematical knowledge and justification, and very unsympathetic to the admission of infinity or infinite series in the philosophy of mathematics. That's why a figure like Poincaré, which begins to work at the same time than Couturat, is viewed in this context both as a Kantian. Russell, for instance, says when he translates the science and method, when he prefaces the translation of Science and Methods, he says, I take Poincaré to be a full Kantian, strongly committed to Kantian thesis, but also as an anti-Kantian in his rejection of finitism and the multiple possible intuitions that can be used to choose between alternative geometries. And the same, at the same time, Kantian and anti-Kantian character can be attributed mutatis mutandis to Couturat. In fact, the two thinkers would engage in a lifelong fight with two particular episodes. First, in 1893 to 1897, and then in the final years of 1905 and 1906. The 1983 discussion has its origin in a paper by Poincaré on non-Euclidean geometries, to which Couturat will respond, and this discussion will go for 4 years. Since his first discussion with Poincaré, Couturat has been searching what can be called an ontological or realist foundation for mathematics. Mathematics should not be conceived merely as an empty formalism, but as a true science about existent objects. This is one of the reasons, for instance, of the centrality of existence theorems in the principles, principe de mathématique, which is very particular to the rendering that Couturat does of the Russell's principles of mathematics. Since mathematics deals with truth and abstract truth, there's no real way of separating mathematics and philosophy. The expression of choice in French philosophy at the time will be that of a philosophie mathématique, a mathematical philosophy, like Russell in 1919 and like Brunswick in his seminal book, Les étapes de la philosophie mathématique, the stages of philosophical mathematics. And in his doctoral thesis, called De l'infini mathématique, this conception of philosophy by Couturat is developed, and I want to take a closer look at it now. If we read the beginning of the Infini Mathématique, this beginning can be read as a manifesto for a new philosophy that blends Renouvier neo-criticism with more decidedly Kantian overtones, neo-Kantian overtones, neo-Kantian in the sense that they resemble more to what was being done in Germany at that time. So that's a blending of neo-criticism, Renouvier neo-criticism, historicism about science and philosophy, the second main tenet, and what was called at that time, for a numerous group of thinkers, the French reflexive rationalism, shared by Couturat and the other founders of the Revue de Métaphysique et Morale. This reflexive rationalism was opposed, for instance, to what they called sociologism and psychologism. We must remember that the rival of the Revue de Métaphysique et Morale at that time was the Revue Philosophique de France et de l'Étranger, that was directed by Théodule Rivaux, a psychologist, and gave space, for instance, to Durkheim and his disciples on the sociological side. So there was a rivalry that was reflected in the opposition of those two publications in France at that time. Philosophy, which in antiquity was the same as science, it's the beginning of the assessment of Couturat, progressively separated from science and renounced it as being a knowledge of the universe to become, I quote Couturat, a knowledge of a higher order, a second degree in reflection and systematization of the facts, and a new elaboration of the given from experience. The given from experience is a translation of the des données de l'expérience. That's in page 5 in Romans in Infini Mathématique. His object, once the familiar of philosophy, once the familiar world of everyday experience, now must be the idea, I quote, the ideal world built by physics. Philosophy must inquire over scientific laws because they are what make this world intelligible. In fact, the first definition of philosophy by Couturat could be, I quote again, philosophy does not study things and facts, but ideas. Not the laws of nature, but the laws of the mind, esprit. Philosophy is essentially a theory of knowledge, and its true name is critique. We see here very clearly what I call the neo-Kantian overtones and the neo-criticism impact in Renouvier. In other words, philosophy must be a philosophy of science, of sciences in the plural, not of science conceived as one unitary body of knowledge. I quote again, the task of philosophy is to explain science. That is, to justify, end quote, that is, justify its foundation, and in this task, philosophy must take into account the most recent results of the science, just like, according to Couturat, Aristotle and Kant did. But for Couturat, the most fruitful collaboration between philosophy, mathematics, and the science is to be found in the 17th century. His rationalism, Couturat's rationalism, is, and this should come not come as a shock to no one, mainly modeled on Leibniz, what Couturat calls Leibniz's absolute rationalism. Like in the 1905 leçon inaugurale at the Collège de France, what Couturat does here is to establish the nature of philosophy by negatively contrasting it against the main currents of the thought in France at this period. The list he gives is different here and helps to understand who were the targets of his program. The first target is what he would call later psychologists, but he is here identified as only, quote, the study of consciousness by the method of introspection, both in its idealist, I mean Cousin, Victor Cousin, Théodore Jouffroy, but also physiological, like Théodule Ribot, Janet versions. And then he identifies, he will later separate them, what he calls eclecticism and positivism as other currents that pervert the right understanding of the role and nature of philosophy. I will pass the criticism that he does for every one of these currents, but I want to quote his conclusion in length. Beginning quote. Both of them, eclecticism and positivism, missed their target because they violated the principle of the critique, that metaphysics consists of synthetic a priori judgments, and vainly tried to replace it by logical truth, analytical judgments, or by experimental laws, synthetic a posteriori judgments. They forgot just one thing, that truth, both logical or scientific, are relative to the thinking mind and are true just as long as they conform to rational principles. End quote. This is in page 9 of Infini Mathématique. This allows to introduce Couturat's particular brand of rationalism. Critical problems, I quote, are not about logic or experience, but about reason. The second order inquiry of philosophy is about reason, and reason determines the first order inquiries of logic and physics. Reason is defined through appeal to a formula attributed to Cournot, and which Couturat says inspired his whole work. And I will quote the Cournot bit. This is Cournot. The task of all critique and all philosophy, consists in choosing between many chains of equally logical concepts, the most rational, that is, the one who places more unity, more light, more harmony in our ideas, and by reattaching them to some simple primordial ideas. So this is a Cournotian version of the Kantian regulative use of reason. Philosophy must then become a philosophy of science tout court, must become a philosophy of science, but in what can be called a reflexively rational setting. I quote again Couturat, philosophy is first and foremost a general critique of science, because every science leans on principles or notions that are supra-scientific and that science cannot verify because it presupposes them. This much more modest proposal would be soon corrected by Couturat when he explained that philosophy of science is also a theory of knowledge, and as it were, also a theory of being, that is, a metaphysics. The only case in which reason cannot grasp reality would be if the antinomies were real contradictions. But that is not the case, since for Couturat, the antinomies express not the conflict of reason itself with itself, but a conflict of faculties, sensibility and understanding, or imagination and sensibility, that can be dissolved by the higher faculty of reason. Page 14 in Roman numerals of Infini Mathematique. This metaphysics is conceived, I quote again, as a system of the principles of nature, and Couturat is taking this phrase directly from the metaphysical principles of natural science from Kant. These principles being our laws of thought. So this is the first characterization of philosophy in Couturat. So I have only 10 minutes, so I will skip some things and jump forward. And I want to compare this with the treatment of the relationship between philosophy, science, and mathematics in the last period of Couturat philosophy, 1905-1906. And I use for this both the Principes de Mathématiques and the inaugural lesson from the Collège de France. What's the principle? Les Principes de Mathématiques are a book written by reuniting the reviews of the different chapters of Russell's Principles of Mathematics. We can see a direct change or shift in Couturat's thought by the direct influence of Russell in his studies. So after this programmatic work, there is a radical shift in his philosophy that can be attributed to his double discovery of Russell. First, by reading his essay on the foundation of geometry from 1897, which pushed him away from his Poincarian affinities of 1893, and then the principles of mathematics that will be reviewed in a series of articles for the Revue de Métaphysique et Morale that will become Les Principes de Mathématiques. The main difference between the structure of the principles of mathematics and Les Principes de Mathématiques is the inversion of the chapter about order. It's important, but I will not deal with it here. And the substitution of the last chapter on matter and motion in the principles by a critique of Kant, the famous article on Kant's philosophy of mathematics, as closing the Principes de Mathématiques by Couturat. A long correspondence between the two, Russell and Couturat, fueled by their mutual interest not only on the foundations of mathematics but also for Leibniz, went on. And this interest for Leibniz took Leibniz not as an historical figure, but rather as a logician and philosopher on its own rights. First, one of the changes that we have here is the transposition of the historicist model from Infini Mathematique. There, in Infini Mathematique, we saw the progressive divorce between science and philosophy. Here, we see the progressive approximation, the convergence of science and of logic and mathematics. Divorced at their beginnings, modernity, and especially the 19th century, saw what Couturat calls the fusion of both in a common science for which logistique, the name he gave to his kind of logicism, is the tool. This is in page 6 of Les Principes de Mathématiques. As Couturat puts it, I quote, "We cannot say where logic ends and where mathematics begins." This is a change from 1986. And the most prominent example of this approximation can be found in the case of geometry. I'd like to point that when Couturat speaks about the new axiomatization of geometry, even in 1905, he is referring not to Hilbert, but mainly to the Italians, Burari-Forti and Pieri. In the case of the logicist project, his model is not Frege, which he quotes only by preoccupation by worry of chronological complex to dismiss him. but Russell and Peano. Those are the models for his logicism, his logistic. For instance, we can read in the page 181 of Les Principes des Mathématiques, many are the works of contemporary geometers on the principles of geometry. The most deep and complete of those are those carried out by means of the logistic, because this instrument of abstraction and precision allows us to expose the vicious circles, avoid paralogism, and appeals to intuition, and bypass the associations of ideas and thinking habits that are attached to ordinary language, langage usuel. So this quote is a kind of definition of how he conceives his logistic. It's an instrument of abstraction and precision that allows to avoid logical failures and to correct ordinary language, and then put our understanding of science in a new, better level. I'm finishing, just 2 more minutes. The distinction between general logic and logistic is made in terms of the distinction between pure and applied mathematics now. This distinction is important in Couturat because even in his final period, he still admitted that intuition, in this case sensible intuition, may play a role in what he calls applied mathematics. Geometry is pure when developed from the point of view of analysis and group theory, but applied when mixed with the idea of grandeur, quantity, and also when mixed with numbers. From an ontological point of view, Couturat seems to be extending his notion of mathematical objects in geometry, abandoning all the reference to space, and now wording his definitions in the Riemannian vocabulary of ordered multiplicities and multidimensional series. However, in order to allow the existence of diverse geometries, you will find the central concept of geometry in the point, which the different geometries conceive as, I quote, it's page 211 of Les Principes des Mathématiques, are conceived as indeterminate and indifferent. So they must be conceived, the points must be conceived in terms of quantities, of grandeur, but not in terms of numbers, as the linear arithmetical intuition of the temporal series in Kant was. The last part of the Les Principes des Mathématiques is, in fact, wants to show that there is a strategy to unify projective, descriptive, and metrical geometries. I want to study this point. I'm just beginning my research by substituting and generalizing the old elements, special points, and what he calls grandeur concrete quantities by new ones, abstract magnitudes, and the concept of order. And those new concepts may only have a partial correspondence of the previous one of the different geometries. In concluding, his staunch rationalism, however, remains now untouched, and is expressed here in a critique and rejection of what he calls nominalism. That is a consequence of Poincaré conventionalism in the field of mathematics, but also of the 4 isms that he studies in the inaugural lesson of the Collège de France, sociologisme, psychologisme, criticisme, and pragmatism. It's also now his rationalism, a theory which he associates with, excuse me, let me rephrase this. He associates these 4 E's also in mathematics with what he calls Poincaré disguised definitions that he reads as genetic definitions, just like, for instance, genetic definitions of the price shift of Kant in 1763. The relationship between science and philosophy needs a static a framework, that is, a restraining of creative definitions by reality and by the general principles of philosophy, like the main principle being the principle of reason, that which he interprets, Couturat, in the Leibnizian vocabulary of as all propositions are analytic. The principle of continuity is interpreted then at the end of Les Principes de Mathématiques as a philosophical principle that applies to everything in reality, mathematics being only a special case of this. And the construction of number in Infinite Mathematics is reminiscent of that. That's also why Couturat always opposed the distinction between a logic of invention and or discovery and a logic of justification. In the long run of the humanity, if we adopt logistics, they will both coincide. However, that's my final paragraph, a main difference here is to be found in the modification of the concept of reason itself, which is not anymore regulative, like in the Infinite Mathematics, but conceived in more substantive terms. The reason, now weighted by logistique, must be able to warrant the rationality of science and the clarity of its exposition. That is achieved by the overarching of philosophical principles over mathematical principles. If mathematics and logic could now be identified, they are still under the jurisdiction of philosophical reason, conceived under the old-fashioned guise of old French 17th century rationalism. Couturat, who once said that he hated history, seems pretty much defined by it. That was my talk. Just let me add a final consideration. So my diagnostic here, or where I'm going with this research, is to show that there were internal factors in the French conception of philosophy and the philosophical climate that make it impossible for logicists to develop independently as a technique and as a program. Logicism was not adopted by the main participants in French philosophical dialogue, nor by the Kantian finitists, not by Poincaré. And when we have a champion of this new logical symbolism, that is Couturat, he still frames it in terms of an old-fashioned conception of philosophy that is pretty much Kantian and pretty much heiress from Leibniz, also conception of reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ernesto. Now we have time for a few questions, beginning with our researchers here online. Are there any questions for Professor Ernesto?
I have a clarificatory question. You were rushing a little bit at the end, Ernesto. I know it's time.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, it seems that you were saying that Couturat changed a little bit from more of a perception or intuition-based mathematics to a more logicist approach to the foundation of mathematics, in the sense that, and particularly, I like to concentrate on the example of the new kinds of geometry, non-Euclidean geometry. So you're saying that he didn't accept non-Euclidean geometries at a par with the Euclidean geometries in the first phase, and then he developed a new understanding that actually started accepting these new geometries. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can put it that way. What happens is that he separates what he calls pure geometry and applied geometry. Pure geometry in the Principes de Mathématiques seems to be conceived in abstract terms as a kind of, let's say, topological geometry, or non-metric, at least non-metric geometry. Okay, in his first writings, he seems to be considering what pure geometry, Euclidean geometry, in pretty much Kantian terms, and considering, for instance, projective geometries, meta geometries as applied geometries that can be useful in restricted parts of reality. It's more or less this kind of relationship that he establishes. But also in the Principe de Mathématique, he identifies three main kinds of geometry: projective, metrical, and descriptive geometries, as he calls them. And he says that there is one sphere of unification of these three geometries, that is the consideration of of points as ordered in a series that is not a numerical series. And this is the new path that he's trying to engage with in that moment. There are many other papers that are not his books that are important here. For instance, to answer this, we should take a look. I should take a look more closely to the two polemics with Poincaré, both his 1893 polemics about geometry, but also his 1905-1906 polemics about logistics in the Principles of Mathematics. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to wrap it up a little bit, it's just it's very interesting because he didn't get a chance to deal with general relativity later, and especially because of his Kantian principles that philosophy should be philosophy of science. Then it would become very clear how non-Euclidean geometries would have to be taken to the center stage, right? Because of these new scientific contributions. And they cannot be relegated to maybe just particular cases, right? So it's a shame.
As I said in the beginning, when we read French philosophy of that time, it's like some things pass by sight, but they are not treated. They are not received by the French. And the special theory of relativity is one case. We have Poincaré that writes some things, but Couturat doesn't touch on the subject. And the main actors when Einstein is writing his papers are not sympathetic to general theory of relativity. Bergson, Le Chalat, for instance, also. And then we have just minor figures that do serious work on theory of relativity, like, for instance, another philosophe scientifique that is called Abel Rey. Abel Rey will be the almost the only one that takes seriously into account the general theory of the theory of relativity from Einstein in France in the first decades of the 20th century.
Okay, we have time for one more brief question from our researchers here online. And if there are no more questions from our researchers, then we'll have to see if there are any questions from the audience, from our online audience. No? Okay, so no more questions. Okay, thank you, Professor Ernesto. We'll now have a talk by Professor Luis Felipe from the Federal University of Santa Catarina. Thank you for being here, Professor. Professor, your audio is turned off, unfortunately. There you go.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. My presentation will be in Portuguese, and I apologize for that. I'm going to read some excerpts from a text that I think it's outdated, but which deals with a central theme for understanding Husserl's philosophy of logic, the analytic synthetic distinction and the problem of the nature of logical truths. So I pass to the text, and at some point I will skip some parts. So, bom, vou falar em português. Eu vou ler o texto que eu havia preparado e eventualmente vou pular algumas partes. É a distinção analítico-sintético possível? Bom, com a publicação dos dois dogmas do empirismo, a distinção entre verdades analíticas e sintéticas parece ter sofrido um duro golpe. Rejeitando a crença entre uma clivagem fundamental entre diferentes tipos de verdade, Quine adota uma posição holista que visa apagar a fronteira entre o domínio do formal e aquele do factual, recusando-se, com isso, a distinção entre questões de linguagem e questões de fato. Problematizando a diferenciação entre enunciados analíticos e empíricos, o autor afirma que, embora seja óbvio que a verdade, em geral, depende tanto da linguagem como dos fatos extralinguísticos, isso não significa que ela seja decomponível em um componente linguístico e um componente factual. Por mais razoável que pareça, adotar essa posição leva à suposição de que alguns enunciados, no caso os analíticos, prescindem do componente factual. Cito Quine, mas, apesar de razoável a priori, com tal posição simplesmente não foi traçada uma fronteira nítida entre enunciados analíticos e sintéticos, e a crença na necessidade de tal distinção constitui um dogma, um artigo metafísico de fé. Então, só para fixar algumas coisas, ele está aqui criticando uma certa formulação da definição kantiana de analiticidade, que é aquela que diz que juízos analíticos são proposições da forma sujeito-predicado, em que o conceito do predicado pertence ou está contido de algum modo, implícita ou explicitamente, no conceito do sujeito. Tá? E tal ligação do sujeito com o predicado deve ser pensada por identidade. Então, nesses juízos, o nosso conhecimento não é modificado nem ampliado de qualquer maneira, né, diz o Kant. Enfim, para o Quine, essa distinção ela não deixa as coisas muito claras. Com o bom humor que lhe é característico, prossegue o autor. De fato, não é difícil encontrar enunciados que são analíticos por aclamação filosófica geral, diz ele. Eles se dividem em duas classes. A primeira, das chamadas verdades lógicas, é caracterizada como a analiticidade em sentido estrito, em que enunciados logicamente verdadeiros são, pois, aqueles dos quais, uma vez suposto o inventário das partículas lógicas, segue-se que eles permanecem verdadeiros em toda e qualquer reinterpretação de suas partículas ou componentes não lógicos. Bom, o Quine vai tratar desses enunciados num outro texto, não no Dois Dogmas, né, mas num texto chamado Carnap and Logical Truth, e nesse texto, logo na primeira página, ele puxa uma nota de rodapé, avisando ao leitor que um colega, Yoshua Bar Hillel, diz a ele que se essa é a posição dele sobre as verdades lógicas, então ele tem uma posição muito próxima à do Bolzano, a definição de analiticidade do Bolzano. Isso depois vários comentadores vão apontar, né, dentre os quais o Peter Simons, o Mark Testor, a Sandra Lapuan e outros. Né? Bom, Quine também aponta uma segunda classe, a das verdades analíticas em sentido lato, que é composta por aqueles enunciados que podem ser transformados em verdades lógicas pela substituição adequada de sinônimos por sinônimos. Então, aqui teríamos um problema, né? Por exemplo, seguindo o Bolzano, como exemplos da primeira classe, temos nenhum homem não casado é casado, o que equivale a nenhum X que é não F é F, e como instância da segundo tipo de analiticidade, nós teríamos nenhum solteiro é casado, clássico, né? O que equivale a nenhum X que é F é G, né? Uma notação um pouco mais contemporânea. Paul Boghossian aponta que aqui residiria um ponto problemático. Sob o mesmo termo analiticidade, Quine designa duas noções distintas, uma pura e outra impura, ou, vamos dizer assim, fraca. Né? A primeira, cito Boghossian, em que a lógica pode contar como analítica, e a segunda, cuja limitação se dá justamente, cito novamente, por pressupor a lógica não podendo ser aplicada à lógica ela própria e tendo sido projetada exclusivamente para abordar a analiticidade de outros tipos de sentenças que não os lógicos. Boghossian chama a atenção para o fato de que, em Dois Dogmas, o texto é todo consagrado à análise detalhada da noção impura ou fraca de analiticidade, uma vez que, para Quine, a maior dificuldade não se encontra na primeira classe de enunciados, mas na segunda e no apelo às noções bastante vagas de significação e sinonímia como seus critérios de elucidação. Bom, eu vou pular uma parte aqui onde eu apresento as definições do Quine e as objeções que ele levanta a cada uma das definições, né? Vou apenas mencionar que uma primeira definição considera que as proposições analíticas, no segundo sentido, são problemáticas porque tem a forma sujeito e predicado, e disso se segue, então, uma segunda crítica, que ela dependeria do conceito de inclusão conceitual, né, aquele estar contido ao qual o Kant se refere lá na crítica da Zampura, seja de modo implícito ou explícito, do conceito predicado no conceito sujeito, e que tudo isso teria sido deixado num nível metafórico. Bom, uma terceira crítica seria que, para resolver essa questão, nós teríamos que apelar a uma teoria do significado, e isso traz consigo o que o Quine chama, num texto até escrito em francês, nos anos 60, de mito da significação, ou então mito do museu, né, em que nós suporíamos que as significações são entidades abstratas e que, mesmo que nós trocássemos de linguagem, nós manteríamos as significações e a linguagem seria apenas um conjunto de rótulos para identificar essas significações, o que apontaria para o problema de como encontramos critérios para estabelecer a igualdade de significações, né? Ele vai recusando, então, essas definições, dizendo, ora, se a sinonímia é a chave para entender a analiticidade, nós não podemos definir sinonímia, porque não há critérios claros para isso, e a gente entra numa espécie de círculo vicioso. Tá? Então, também não poderíamos apelar à ideia de definição nesse ponto, porque a menos que a gente tivesse uma linguagem fortemente regimentada, em que as definições fossem introduzidas exclusivamente para o fim de arbitrariamente estabelecer uma relação entre o definiens e o definiendo, nós não teríamos controle sobre o significado das palavras. E, por fim, ele critica a noção de intersubstitutibilidade salva veritate do Leibniz, dizendo que esse é um critério puramente extensional e que a gente poderia encontrar exemplos em que, embora nós possamos estipular a identidade de significação, isso não garantiria que nós temos analiticidade na medida em que, embora nós possamos apontar para o mesmo referente, isso não quer dizer que os termos tenham o mesmo significado, né? Bom, eu vou passar rapidamente por isso, a gente pode discutir melhor na hora das questões. O que eu quero mesmo frisar é a importância dessa dupla definição de analiticidade, porque a rejeição quiniana da distinção entre enunciados analíticos e sintéticos por meio da explicitação da impossibilidade de definir de forma clara e rigorosa pelo menos um dos termos nela implicados não pode ser simplesmente ignorada. Então, né, já que nós não podemos definir as proposições analíticas ou os enunciados analíticos, a distinção, em geral, não poderia ser traçada entre proposições analíticas e sintéticas, né? Ela salienta aspectos por demais problemáticos para que possamos simplesmente lhe virar as costas. Por outro lado, também não é verdade que sua crítica implica necessariamente o abandono completo dos supostos que fundamentaram as distinções de seus predecessores, como se esses estivessem de todo errados. Como afirma Sandra Lapuan, cito, uma explicação mais razoável consistiria em dizer que a crítica de Quine mostra o fato de que apenas algumas teorias não têm recursos para sustentar de maneira coerente a distinção. Embora o contrário seja amplamente aceito, que a crítica quiniana estenda-se a muitas concepções não implica que se aplique a todas ou que não exista nenhuma maneira de sustentar a distinção. Nesse sentido, em Necessary, A Priori and Analytic, Aaron Sloman propõe uma alternativa àquela formulação baseada na tese de que as noções de necessidade, a prioridade e analiticidade não são suficientemente claras em suas interrelações devido a critérios de determinação de seus escopos respectivos. Segundo Sloman, em um grande número de casos, é possível determinar que proposição é expressa por uma sentença S em função da explicitação de 3 fatores. Primeiro, que coisas particulares correspondem às expressões referenciais em S. Segundo, que conceitos correspondem às expressões descritivas, propriedades e relações expressas em S. E terceiro, o modo como as palavras lógicas e construções utilizadas em S devem ser compreendidas. Por exemplo, se elas são definidas conforme seu emprego usual. O autor acrescenta a observação de que, se a proposição assim expressa é verdadeira ou falsa, dependerá, em muitos casos, de um fator adicional 4, que, como acontece das coisas serem no mundo ou que estados de coisas existem. Em que isso poderia nos ajudar? Entre outras coisas, na investigação das relações entre os fatores B e C assim especificados, pois permitiria mostrar em que consiste a ambiguidade do emprego da noção de analiticidade em Quine de que se queixara Boghossian. Tá? Então, eu vou partir dessa tipificação apresentada pelo Sloman para tentar caracterizar a noção de analiticidade do Russell e distinguir a noção de verdade lógica dele da noção de analiticidade geral e da noção de analiticidade geral do Quine. Então, assim como Quine, Russell se oporá a Kant no que respeita à distinção analítico-sintético. Assumindo aquela formulação como obscura e acusando-a de ser demasiado estreita e errar o alvo, o autor pretende reformulá-la de tal modo que a própria lógica passe a contar como analítica. Ao comparar suas formulações do problema com as de Kant, Russell conclui que aquelas foram equivocadamente avaliadas pela tradição, exceção feita a Bolzano, defendendo que não merecem de forma alguma ser chamadas de clássicas. No que respeita especificamente a Bolzano, sustentar que Russell lhe atribui a influência ou os impulsos decisivos para elaborar parte significativa de suas concepções não caracteriza uma grande descoberta. É o próprio autor que, em pelo menos 3 textos dirigidos à publicação, menciona essa afiliação e lhe tece comentários. Na avaliação de Russell, Bolzano fora bem sucedido no intento de expor de fato a base lógica para uma doutrina da ciência com clareza e rigor científicos e com tal plenitude de pensamentos originais, cientificamente seguros e sempre frutíferos, que não pode deixar de ser reconhecido como um dos maiores lógicos de todos os tempos. Desse modo, parece seguro afirmar que, para Russell, a lógica como ciência encontra na obra de Bolzano uma base sólida, porém incompleta, sobre a qual edificar, pois, a partir dela, pode, e na verdade deve, cito Russell, aprender aquilo de que necessita, precisão matemática nas distinções, exatidão matemática nas teorias, sem, contudo, se limitar à mera, cito novamente, construção engenhosa, ou ao aprimoramento puramente técnico alcançado pelos matemáticos, o qual, por vezes, os impede de apreciar adequadamente, e aqui devemos ler filosoficamente, no sentido da filosofia da lógica, as teorias matemáticas da lógica. Entretanto, apesar de desenvolver a importante teoria das proposições em si, advoga Russell, cito, Bolzano não discute nem favorece explicitamente uma delimitação autônoma de uma lógica pura no sentido em que o Russell a toma, qual seja, cito novamente, enquanto sistema teórico das verdades puramente formais, categoriais, que inclui, cito novamente, naturalmente também, e alargando, a matemática formal com suas teorias a priori, e que finalmente é idêntica a máteses universales no sentido generalizado formulado por Leibniz. Isso se encontra numa recensão crítica a um livro do Melchior Palagi, publicado por Russell antes das investigações lógicas. Do mesmo modo, parece ter faltado a Bolzano, avalia Russell, qualquer consciência da unidade interna da lógica formal com a teoria pura dos números, a teoria das magnitudes, etc., e, ao fim e ao cabo, com a pura teoria das multiplicidades e a teoria das formas puras de teorias. Isso significa que, aos seus olhos, Bolzano não concebeu nem contribuiu decisivamente para explicitar, cito, a equivalência interna entre a natureza analítica, tanto da lógica formal quanto da matemática formal. Aqui uma citação da Claire Ortiz Hill. Algo que, deve-se ressaltar, dependeu das realizações no campo das matemáticas que só tomaram lugar depois da morte de Bolzano. Mais grave, pensa Russell, Bolzano tampouco empreendeu seja uma análise epistemológica dos conceitos lógicos fundamentais, 2, seja a extensão do domínio formal até que fosse capaz de abarcar os conceitos ou categorias ontológicos, demandas diretamente vinculadas às tarefas mais fundamentais da lógica pura, que constituirão o aspecto diferencial do seu próprio projeto, mas que, admite Russell, só se tornaram concebíveis depois da leitura atenta da Wissenschaftslehre. Então, vamos direto à distinção analítico-sintética tal como apresentada pelo Russell. Prima facie, a formulação da distinção analítico-sintética de Russell está clara e indiscutivelmente sob a influência das teses da Wissenschaftslehre, como que as ecoando. Não obstante, em função das limitações gerais apresentadas contra elas, Russell procura reformulá-la, de tal sorte que seja capaz de abranger o que, pensa ele, escapou a Bolzano. Assim, partindo da noção de proposição em si e tomando por base o procedimento substitucional ao qual Bolzano denominou método de variação, a definição de Russell contém, cito, um novo sentido da analiticidade fundado sobre a possibilidade de substituições formais que está enraizada na experiência de matemático, que é a sua e que vem diretamente de Bolzano. A citação do Jocelyn Benoit. Como na Wissenschaftslehre, a distinção é introduzida por meio da definição das proposições analíticas. Russell mantém uma separação de escopo entre aquelas proposições cuja analiticidade deve ser tomada em sentido estrito, no sentido das verdades lógicas, as quais chamou leis a priori analíticas, e um novo grupo, que em parte corresponde àquelas cuja analiticidade é tomada por Bolzano e por Quine em sentido lato, as quais nomeou proposições analiticamente necessárias. Então, aqui o Russell está reformulando a distinção de modo muito próximo a Bolzano, e o que me interessa é justamente comparar essa definição que alguns investigadores caracterizam como a definição Bolzano-Quine de analiticidade de verdade lógica com a definição husserliana de verdade lógica, para ver se elas têm alguma semelhança. Bom, diz o Russell, uma lei a priori analítica, então vejam, as verdades lógicas seriam leis a priori analíticas e as proposições analíticas em geral seriam proposições analiticamente necessárias, num primeiro momento, né? Então, uma lei a priori analítica é uma proposição formalizada, no sentido contemporâneo, né? Livre de todo e qualquer condicionamento materialmente determinado, ou seja, de todo o conteúdo material ou posição de existência. E isso quer dizer, livre de todo e qualquer conteúdo cognitivo. Por quê? Porque um dos critérios para o Quine descartar a analiticidade no sentido geral é que a sinonímia teria algum tipo de aporte cognitivo, né? Estabelecer a igualdade de significado entre dois termos conteria algum tipo de aporte. Funda-se em... uma lei a priori analítica, então, funda-se em categorias puramente formais, tais como algo, ou um, objeto, qualidade, relação, enlace, multiplicidade, número, ordem, todo, parte, etc., opondo-se a conceitos como casa, árvore, cor, som, espaço, sensação, etc., pertencentes ao que o autor denominou regiões materiais, cujas relações são expressas por proposições e leis a priori sintéticas. Aqui caberia um extenso comentário. O professor Simons, por exemplo, aborda a crítica feita pelo Wittgenstein e por Schlick, a noção de proposição sintética do Russell, sintético a priori, e ele afirma que ambos foram desleais com o Russell na medida em que acertem o alvo na crítica às proposições sintéticas, mas percam de vista a definição husserliana de proposição analítica, de lei analítica, né, que até pensa o professor Simons é mais bem definida do que a deles, né? Então, uma lei analítica, por exemplo, fundada na categoria de relação, diz que todo caso simples de dois membros de relação A e B, como, por exemplo, se certo A está numa certa relação com certo B, então este B está em certa relação correspondente com aquele A. A e B são, assim, variáveis ilimitadas, diz o Russell, e a proposição somente articula o conceito de relação em sua indeterminação formal. Por definição, leis analíticas são proposições incondicionalmente universais, diz o Russell, que não contêm outros conceitos que não os formais, e, por conseguinte, quando retrocedemos aos primitivos, não encontramos senão categorias formais. Isso está na terceira investigação. Ora, não seria equivocado concluir que, para Russell, leis analíticas são proposições cuja determinação e manutenção do valor de verdade depende exclusivamente da investigação do fator C, ou seja, do modo como os termos lógicos se encontram, e da investigação do significado das constantes lógicas empregues e da estrutura da sentença e do modo como elas são aplicadas do ponto de vista de considerações puramente lógicas, sem levar em conta os fatores A, B e D considerados pelo Sloman, que são os fatores que determinam como os termos não lógicos são definidos ou introduzidos, né, ou o modo como as coisas são. Nas palavras do Sloman, em uma formulação absurdamente próxima à do Bolzano, tais proposições são, cito, logicamente verdadeiras ou logicamente falsas, ou verdadeiras ou falsas, em virtude de sua forma lógica. isto é, de sua neutralidade com relação ao conteúdo. Bem, se nós seguirmos o argumento Russell e introduzirmos conceitos respeitantes ao conteúdo nas leis analíticas, resultam proposições analiticamente necessárias, pois, cito Russell, em geral, as particularizações de leis resultam em necessidades, e aqui também as particularizações de leis analíticas resultam em necessidades analíticas. Na particularização de uma lei, os conceitos ou categorias materiais pertencentes a um domínio ou região definidos, assim como a posição individual de existência, ocupam os lugares apropriados, aqueles lugares que são definidos pelos fatores A, B e D do esquema do Sloman, da relação formal que fora esquematicamente expressa, e isso quer dizer aquelas posições indicadas nas sentenças por variáveis ilimitadas. Contudo, a verdade dessas proposições permanece independente do modo peculiar respeitante ao conteúdo e é a sua eventual facticidade, pois, ao fim e ao cabo, constituem meras aplicações empíricas das leis formais ou analíticas. Nas palavras de Russell, nas proposições analíticas, cito, tem de ser possível substituir cada matéria respeitante ao conteúdo pela forma vazia qualquer coisa, o que implica substituir cada posição de existência pela passagem à forma judicativa correspondente da universalidade incondicionada ou da legalidade. Fim de citação. Ou seja, a cada passo devemos ser capazes de novamente formalizá-las. Como afirmou o autor, cito, nas proposições analíticas pré-dadas, todas as determinações respeitantes ao conteúdo devem poder ser primeiramente substituídas por algo indeterminado para, somente então, serem captadas como variáveis ilimitadas, e esse trecho está na primeira edição das investigações, ele foi suprimido da segunda, né? Nesse procedimento, importa apenas, cito novamente, agora a terceira investigação lógica, a completa conservação da forma lógica da proposição. Mas, como sustenta Mark Testor, essa versão do método substitucional ou de variação contém uma diferença crucial e que representa a um só tempo uma restrição de suas possibilidades e uma ampliação de seu escopo. Mais que uma simples aplicação daquela definição de Bolzano, em que uma verdade é uma verdade lógica, para resumir, se suas partes não lógicas podem ser arbitrariamente variadas, sem que o valor de verdade se modifique, trata-se de mostrar que, cito novamente Textor, uma proposição é uma proposição analiticamente necessária, para resumir, se não podemos fazer variar arbitrariamente seus componentes não formais, sem que o valor de verdade se modifique. Isso ocorre, segundo Textor, porque, cito novamente, o conceito husserliano de conceito formal é mais abrangente que aquele bolzaniano de parte lógica, englobando aspectos ontológicos. Assim, a ampliação do escopo da definição de analiticidade se dá, inicialmente, pela inclusão dos conceitos e categorias da matemática formal em seu domínio, que agora é capaz de englobar tanto os conceitos lógicos quanto os conceitos ontológico-formais, diz o Mark Testor. Em uma formulação alternativa, os conceitos formais ocupariam o lugar dos fatores A e B e no esquema de Sloman. Uma das consequências imediatas desse modo de proceder é a de poder, cito novamente Testor, classificar entre os enunciados analíticos os ontológicos, como, por exemplo, aqueles da meriologia. Claro, aqui vai depender do sistema meriológico que a gente adotar para determinar que objetos são esses e a que leis eles obedecem, né? Por um lado, o aspecto restritivo desse movimento se manifesta no fato de que, tanto em Bolzano quanto em Russell, o que determina a analiticidade é 1. A possibilidade da substituição, 2. Da extensão de certo campo de variações e 3. A possibilidade de, cito Benoit, pôr em variáveis a proposição ela mesma nos limites de sua analiticidade. Por outro lado, isso não significa o mesmo que sustentar que, cito novamente Benoit, uma proposição não será senão variáveis, onde tudo poderia mudar deixando intacta a função lógica da proposição como portadora de verdade. Aos olhos de Benoit, tanto em Bolzano como em Russell, trata-se de uma hipótese, cito novamente, rigorosamente impensável, que tudo fosse variável, né? Para Russell, a introdução dos conceitos ontológicos formais funciona como o mecanismo que evita que isso ocorra. No caso das proposições analiticamente necessárias, que são aplicações de leis analíticas, né? Quando associada ao método de variação, a teoria dos conceitos ou categorias formais assume o papel central. Segundo Stefania Centroni, Bolzano havia mostrado que é logicamente iluminador considerar os resultados de variar sistematicamente alguns dos componentes não proposicionais de uma proposição dentro de certos limites, relativos ao domínio de elementos previamente especificados, cujas equivalências demarcam tal domínio e constituem sua esfera de variação, embora não tenha fornecido um critério indisputável sobre o que significa pertencer a um domínio. Ainda segundo Centroni, à primeira vista, pode-se dizer que sua lógica da variação consiste no exame de relações semióticas que valem entre a proposição X e suas variantes quando alguns componentes de X são substituídos por outros pertencentes à mesma esfera de variação, o que equivale a dizer que a proposição permaneceria verdadeira somente se restringíssemos a esfera de instâncias substitucionais a certa classe de termos. Para Russell, dada a natureza das categorias formais, pertence a cada uma delas, cito Centroni, uma classe de expressões que pode ser substituída por um componente de uma sentença significativa salva congruitate, ou seja, sem prejuízo à gramaticalidade ou à significatividade daquela sentença. Como afirma Russell, em nenhum domínio poderíamos unir não importa que significações por não importa quais formas, mas o domínio das singularidades limita a priori o número de formas possíveis e determina as legalidades de seu preenchimento. Assim, também, exemplo e graça, se nos voltarmos especificamente para o domínio das categorias da significação, respeitantes à primeira tarefa da lógica pura e desenvolvidas na quarta das investigações lógicas, veremos que, cito novamente Russell, não somos livres para conectar uma significação com não importa que significação, pois, numa dada unidade de conexão plena de sentido, não podemos misturar arbitrariamente os elementos de uma forma desordenada. Nem todos os tipos de significação convêm ou podem ser combinados a todos os demais, havendo, cito novamente Russell, certos modos previamente determinados para que constituam, de novo, significações unitárias plenas de sentido, enquanto as possibilidades combinatórias restantes ficam logicamente excluídas, em função de resultarem em quebra de sentido. Por ora, deixemos de lado as especificidades do método de variação adotado por Russell, tomando-as apenas como partes constitutivas de sua definição. Deixa eu dar uma olhadinha aqui no meu tempo, como é que tá? Quantos minutos eu ainda tenho? 3 minutos, gente. Tá. Passou rápido. Então, se voltarmos novamente para a nossa atenção à demarcação entre leis e necessidades analíticas, podemos concluir que, pelo menos, as primeiras devem ser recenseadas por seu parentesco com a definição de Bolzano sob a classe das verdades lógicas de Quine, embora o domínio analítico de Russell seja mais amplo devido à inclusão da matemática pura e de suas categorias. Esse aspecto de sua lógica pura, aparentemente, estaria a salvo das críticas de dois dogmas. Não obstante, essa também não parece ser uma grande descoberta. Como já salientamos, para Quine, a maior dificuldade se encontra não na primeira classe de enunciados analíticos, as verdades lógicas, sua crítica estando interessada somente naquele tipo de analiticidade que compõe a segunda classe, cuja determinação depende do estabelecimento de certas equivalências de significação, implicando a tese da sinonímia cognitiva. Entretanto, se esse é o caso, assim como é a partir de Bolzano, Russell não estaria somente a salvo, senão que teria antecipado de forma decisiva parte importante das análises e da crítica de Quine. Bom, eu estou estourando meu tempo, então, no que viria aqui no texto, eu estabeleceria a distinção precisa das proposições ou dos enunciados analíticos em relação aos sintéticos, para mostrar que o que caracteriza os juízos analíticos, primeiro, é a forma lógica, como a gente viu até aqui, e, em segundo lugar, é que os conceitos que estão relacionados neles não têm uma relação de estar contido, de inércia, como diria o Leibniz, mas que eles são conceitos que implicam uns aos outros, como, por exemplo, o caso que ele cita na terceira investigação lógica, que um todo é composto de suas partes. Esses conceitos não são conceitos que, de algum modo, têm partes que são sinônimos ou que se recobrem, mas eles são conceitos que implicam um ao outro, que são obtidos não porque suas essências estariam relacionadas, como nos enunciados sintéticos, mas porque eles estão logicamente relacionados. Enfim, eu estourei meu tempo, eu acho. Sim? Vamos deixar para as questões, então. Desculpem, o texto era grande.
Perfeito, professor, muito obrigado. Agora nós abrimos para as perguntas da... Opa, um minuto. Agora nós abrimos para as perguntas dos nossos pesquisadores, and we now open to questions from our researchers and also from our online audience. So if anyone has any questions. Okay, Professor Ernesto, por favor.
Luis, thank you for your presentation. I have one question, just a curiosity. You pointed rightly there is a proximity between the method of variation in Husserl and the method of substitutability in Bolzano. But we also pointed that Husserl made some strong critics on Bolzano, pointing to many things that were missing from his treatment. That's not a kind of unfair from Husserl to Bolzano, taking into account the situation of mathematics in the time of Husserl and in the time of Bolzano.
Sim, eu penso que sim, mas ele próprio tenta se resguardar disso, dizendo, não, mas veja, muitos inéditos do Leibniz foram descobertos depois que o Bolzano escreveu, e ele não tomou em consideração a ideia de uma lógica pura ou da matemática como uma ontologia formal para a lógica. Que aí isso é o ponto, eu explorei esse tema na minha tese em função de determinar o que o Husserl entende por uma ontologia analítica. Eu precisava saber como a noção de forma lógica é definida dentro da lógica pura, considerando que a lógica pura é composta pela lógica formal e pela ontologia formal, e prescinde de considerações fenomenológicas, ou seja, tudo aquilo que é material está fora, de algum modo, e não pode fundar essa disciplina da lógica pura. Então, nesse sentido, já estou fugindo um pouco da tua questão, ele atribui tudo ao Bolzano, mas ele diz, olha, parece que há mais ali que o Bolzano não teria percebido, mas isso é devido ao fato dele não ter conhecido os inéditos do Leibniz, nem ter acompanhado os últimos desenvolvimentos da matemática. É nesse sentido. Mas me parece que ali tem uma definição de analiticidade que é interessante, que de algum modo antecipa e de algum modo escapa à crítica dos dois dogmas. Depois, quando o Quine vai definir a analiticidade como verdade lógica, seja no Carnap and Logical Truth, seja lá no Methods of Logic, a definição é, em certo sentido, bolzaniana, e ela está muito próxima do Husserl. Acho que não pega a definição dele nesse sentido, né?
Uhum. Obrigado.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions from our researchers. No? Okay, so let's see if there are any questions from our online audience. No? So I think that's it. So any questions from researchers? No? Okay. So thank you, Professor Felipe, for being here with us. We'll now move to our final presentation by Arthur Hellebrito, PhD from Columbia University. Thank you, Arthur, for being here with us.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for putting this together. It's a great opportunity to discuss our work. I'll just go straight into it. Just to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. My PhD thesis was about the notion of continuity through history, and especially culminating in what Brentano was talking about in the 20s, when he was dictating some papers on these and related issues. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of this notion of continuity, and because I think it's interesting, because it really helps us to locate Bentham in this story and to shed some light on what he was talking about. So first of all, let me just point out that nowadays the notion of continuity is very, very important for mathematics. And it has but it has a slightly different interpretation in the formal disciplines, where it's usually connected with the notion of functions, right? So the idea is that maybe we have this intuition that a continuous function is a function that can be drawn on a piece of paper without taking the pen off the paper, right? Something like that. And then this notion is cashed out in terms of the epsilon delta definition, right? And the idea that if we go to a nearby argument for the function, we get a nearby value for the function, right? So the idea is then cashed out in terms of this nearby idea, right? Which is essentially a topological idea, right? So it's not that these notions are completely different, but they're slightly different, but they also connect to each other, as we'll see. So, but then I'm talking about this just to clarify that in the beginning, when people were starting to think about this notion of continuity, continuity was cashed out much more in terms of this notion of gaplessness, right? Than about this notion of being nearby, and it's not even connected to the notion of function. There was no notion of function, right? So it's just the idea about something being without gaps. And the first one to formalize this was maybe, of course, Aristotle. And so let's just read what he had to say in the book 5 of the Physics, right? So in this, he's defining, it's maybe his official definition of the notion of continuity, but it's also a definition of a notion of being next in succession, and also of being contiguous, right? So let's see what he has to say. He says, and I quote, a thing is in succession when it's after the beginning in position, or in form, or in some other respect, which is definitely so regarded. And when further, there is nothing of the same kind as itself between it and to which is in succession. So the idea is that being in succession is being and is not having something of the same kind between this which is in succession and the thing was just before, right? So it's maybe it's the first idea, or what is being next, what is it to be next to another thing, right? And then he says that a thing that is in succession and touches is contiguous, right? So being contiguous is a little bit more than being in succession, right? So it has to be in succession and touch. And then he says that the continuous is a subdivision of the contiguous, right? So it's even stronger than being contiguous, because he says that things are called continuous when the touching limits of which become one and the same. So this is the important idea. First of all, we have to start by understanding this notion of a limit, right? So, and this is my so first of all, I want to say that this notion, this word limit, is not a bad translation at all for what Aristotle was talking about. It's just that with history, things that were referred to as these limits by Aristotle became well known in mathematics, especially by the time of Brentano, as boundaries, right? So, which is also a word that is used for the translation of Aristotle in this sense, or this particular Greek word of Aristotle. But limit is more of a commonplace translation in the literature. But I just want to stress that I'm going to use from here on the notion of a boundary, because it helps us connect these notions with the Brentanian terminology, okay? So so I'm just going to quote another a quote from Aristotle from Metaphysics, just to give you a hint that this is not a bad translation as well, a boundary, right? So he says that, and I quote, "We call a limit the extremity of each thing, that is, the first thing outside of which no part of the thing is to be found, and the first thing inside of which every part of the thing is to be found." And I just want to quote this because this is word for word the mathematical definition of the notion of boundary. Okay, so just to make clear that this translation is not bad at all. And then, so to understand this notion of a boundary for Aristotle, we have to understand this notion of an indivisible. Okay, so this term in ancient Greece could mean different things. So it could mean either extended atoms that cannot be divided because of some physical impossibility. Okay, so indivisible is also always a thing that cannot be divided, right? So we have this idea that it could be extended things that cannot be further subdivided because some physical impossibility or metaphysical impossibility, okay? But then we have this idea, this first idea we're going to call like the thick conception of atoms, and we're going to discard it because more importantly for Brentano and for mathematics later on is the idea of an indivisible that is indivisible not because of some physical or metaphysical impossibility, but because it really does not have any stretch for it to be divided into, okay? So it's the idea of not having a dimension in some dimension, or having zero dimension in some dimension, okay? And although it's not clear, there's no clear and explicit claim in Aristotle to identify these these boundaries, these limits with indivisibles, it seems to be a very natural move to carry out this identification. For instance, it's extremely natural to consider 2 points as the boundary of a line, right? Or to consider the circle as the boundary of a two-dimensional disk, or etc. Okay, and so we're going to make this as an exegetical assumption, and we're going to do this because we understand that Aristotle is really talking about these things, as we'll see from further on. So, what's important for us to understand is what consequences this interpretation has, right? So the first consequence is that we have to, it's the Aristotelian thesis that boundaries are not substances. And we'll see how this relates to the idea of indivisibles, right? So how the identification of boundaries with indivisibles plays a role in determining this thesis, right? So the idea is that in Aristotle, in the philosophical framework of Aristotle, we have a distinction between substances and things that belong to these substances, right? And the idea is that substances are primary. They have ontological independence, right? They can exist by themselves. Whether all these other things that are not substances always accrue to some substance or require the existence of this substance to exist, right? And the idea is that so boundaries are exactly of this kind for Aristotle. Boundaries are not something that exists independently of the substance they bound, right? So this is very important, and this is one of the main characteristics of the Aristotelian position, right? So let's give another example of a passage where this is relevant. So he says, now if the terms continuous, in contact, and in succession are understood as defined above, nothing that is continuous can be composed out of indivisibles. So this is the idea. For the extremities of 2 points cannot be one, since the indivisible there can be no extremity as distinct from some other part, nor together, since that which has no parts can have no extremity, the extremity and the thing of which is the extremity being distinct. Moreover, if that which is continuous is composed out of points, these points might. Sorry. So here he just goes on to say that how these continuous things cannot be composed out of points. And so the whole idea behind this is that essentially they cannot be composed out of points because points are boundaries and boundaries are universals. And universals are not substances, but are something, they are things that accrue to those substances, right? So just to wrap it up a little bit, so we have it's really hard to understand these things. We have to really nitpick passages from Aristotle. He never gives a full account. Sometimes he talks about continuous things in terms of their boundaries. Sometimes he talks about it in terms of continuous divisibility, and it's hard to understand how these two things relate. But if we see, for instance, Aquinas' conclusion regarding this topic in his commentary, then things start to become much clearer in the sense. So he says that, and the truth of the matter is that mathematical entities of this kind are not substances of things, and thus cannot compose things, but are accidents which accrue to substances. But this mistake about continuous quantities is due to the fact that no distinction is made between the sort of body which belongs to the genus of substance and the sort which belongs to the genus of quantity. For body belongs to the genus of substance, according to which is composed the matter or form, and dimensions are a natural consequence of this in corporeal matters. So here he's stating very clearly that the substances are indeed the corporeal things that have three-dimensional properties, that have some sort of dimension, so some sort of value, right, in every dimension, and that these are the things are just universals. The boundaries are just universals that accrue to these substances, right? Just in conclusion, we can just say that, so for Aristotle, what's important to take from this is that to Aristotle, the notion of a continuous thing is characterized both by its infinite divisibility and by the fact that it possesses a fundamental unity that is characterized by the property that any pairs of parts which exhaust the continuum must share a boundary. So the idea is that one is the definition that we were talking about, right? That for something to be continuous, you need to not only to share this boundary, but this boundary sort of to disappear, right? And the other is the idea of continuous divisibility or infinite divisibility, which is the idea that given two parts of a continuum, we can always find a boundary that divides these two parts, okay? So there is no part of the continuum that is indivisible, okay? And this is clear, for instance, in this passage of the physics, where it says that in the act of dividing the continuous distance into two halves, one point is treated as two, since we're making it a beginning and an end. So this idea that this is important because it's going to be very important for Brentano later on. The idea that when we divide a continuous entity, we're creating a boundary. But the idea is that this boundary is somehow twofold, okay? It's the idea that it's a beginning of one part, but it's also the ending point. Okay, and so this is the Aristotelian position. It's been rediscovered in the Middle Ages, like most of the other Aristotelian ideas. And I want to point out that there is a tradition in the Middle Ages that is essentially carried out by Henry of Ghent, Hugh Newcastle, and John Baconthorpe. And it's been called quasi-Aristotelianism. And the idea is that they full-on recognize that boundaries or limits could have this double existence as both a beginning and an end. Okay, and so this is interesting because what happened after the Middle Ages, or more precisely, towards the end of the Middle Ages, we have new developments in mathematical theories of integration. And these new developments, I'm not going to go into the details, but these new developments essentially calculated areas and volumes of objects by characterizing those objects as being composed out of less dimensional objects. Okay, so for instance, we have the idea that a cube is to be conceived as a bunch of squares, right, being put right beside each other, an infinitude of squares being put one beside the other. And the idea is that we can calculate the volume of the cube by somehow multiplying the areas, right, of the rectangles or the squares by how many of those are there, right? And this is essentially the classic idea of integration, right? And because these methods became more and more consolidated, somehow this went against the idea that things or substances cannot be composed out of indivisible things, right? Because here we have a clear mathematical method that really presents great results or really strong results, and that essentially relies on the idea that the thing whose volume we're trying to calculate is indeed composed out of indivisibles. Okay, and this point became essentially so widespread in mathematics, or these principles or methods became so widespread in mathematics that was the idea that things cannot be composed out of indivisibles really lost its strength, to a point in which by the time Brentano was writing, we have essentially what amounts to a rigorous characterization of mathematics in terms of indivisibles, right? So what do I mean by that? In the 19th century, so this idea that led to these methods of integration essentially were used to create what we now recognize as the foundation of mathematics, which is essentially set theory, right? Because what was happening was that, well, many mathematicians, but essentially with Cantor and essentially with the work of Cantor, everything became fairly well established. And the idea was that we can recache topological concepts, for instance, near, or something being near something else, or even the notion of continuity. We can recache all these concepts in terms of the idea of a point and a set. And essentially a point is the most indivisible of things, right? Because if we're considering an indivisible to be something that has no dimension in some of the 3 dimensions, a point is that thing which has no dimensions. So it is the indivisible, the most indivisible thing we can find. And now we see at the beginning of 20th century, all of mathematics being recast in terms of these indivisibles, okay? So this is the situation which Brentano finds himself in the beginning of the 20th century, or in the 1920s when he was writing these papers, dictating them at least. And we all know that Brentano is essentially an Aristotelian, right? So he has his roots in Aristotelianism, and this is an idea that becomes very clear when we think about this topic, because what he wants to do is essentially criticize this mathematical revolution of constructing mathematics in terms of indivisibles. And it's a really strong idea, and it's very interesting. I'm not sure if it's feasible or not feasible or interesting. It's definitely interesting, and it becomes more interesting when one compares the Brentanian position with, for instance, Whitehead, that has this idea of pointless topologies and stuff like that, pointless objects, and how to construct points in terms of regions. And Brentano is very interesting in sort of showing the importance of thinking about regions and geometry in a more Aristotelian and different way from what was doing in mathematics. So let's talk about a little bit about. I have 10 minutes. Okay, I have exactly 10 minutes. So let's use these 10 minutes to talk a little bit about how Brentano developed these ideas in his paper. So first, just to remind ourselves a little bit that so his main philosophical goal was to provide a philosophical foundation for a truly scientific psychology, right? We all agree with that. He was not very interested in mathematics per se, but he was interested in what mathematics had to offer to a proper scientific presentation of psychology, right? And so in this context, for him, a philosophical account of psychology was essentially to be carried out as an account of how the objects are given to us, or in our perception, right? Or more technically, how these objects are intentionally present to a cognizing subject, right? So with this said, we have to then understand that his idea is not to recast mathematical topology or reconstruct mathematical topology as a completely different science. He's much more concerned about presenting what we might call a specific topology for the objects that are presented in our experience, or something like that. Okay, so it's not, he doesn't want to change how topology is made. He just wants to present an interesting topology for the objects that are presented to a subject. Okay, and so his project is to present an account of this property of continuity, because he believes that this property is just ubiquitously present in our common experience of both the objects of the external world and of ourselves as subject of this world. Okay. And to do so, we have to understand that for Brentano, right, there are 2 ways that we can acquire concepts in general, right? from his anti-rationalist perspective, we cannot have a priori concepts, right? So that's already ruled out. So the only ways we can get concepts for Brentano, it's either given some intuition or by means of what he calls marks, right? Merkmale, which is a very traditional expression in the German philosophical tradition, right? So it's the distinction between something being given on intuition or something being given through marks. And he believes that the mathematical constructions, right, of essentially the continual real numbers, right? Because what we have with the development of mathematics in the 19th century is the substitution of this idea of continua in the plural with the notion of the continuum of real numbers, right? Because it became clear that every continuous geometry can be cashed out in terms of many the Cartesian product of many copies of the real numbers, right? So the notion of continuity in this case started to be inherent to the notion of the real numbers and only borrowed by the continuous objects because they were somehow isomorphic to the real numbers of some sort. So the idea is that the main point about introducing points to topology is exactly to make this correspondence with the real numbers, okay? And so Brentano, in order to criticize this, is criticizing the very construction, the very mathematical constructions of the real numbers that were presented, for instance, by Cantor, right, or Dedekind, the two main ones, right? And so Brentano's criticism then is not to be understood as a thorough refutation, okay? So what he wants to do is much more of a double attack, let's say. So first, he has to show that there's essentially some kind of intuitive unnaturalness of the mathematical constructions of continua that he's showing, okay? And then he presents a new way of thinking about continua that is much more in tune with how these continuous objects are presented in our everyday experience, right? So with this, he wants the reader to conclude that it's much more reasonable to take his position over the much more complicated and unintuitive construction given by his contemporary colleagues, mathematical colleagues, right? And so essentially, he says that under these assumptions, it would be an absurdity to think about these continuous objects in terms of their points, because they're just given to us in experience as objects, right? And so the boundaries of these objects are essentially something that is a property of these objects. They are not given to us prior to the objects themselves, but they are a property of this object that we have to separate in order to understand, right? And also, this has to do with the notion of actual infinities and how Brentano dismissed this notion of actual infinities, right? Because also when you're considering points as the foundations of an extended object, you have to assume that there is an infinite number of points, because if you don't, there's always the object is not going to be continuous, right? There's all even unfortunately we have Brentano not fully understanding this point, which is essentially what dictated the introduction of a notion of continuity that is different from the notion of density. Okay, so density is the property that between every 2 points, you have always 1 point in the middle. And then you have the idea of continuity, either cashed out in terms of a least upper bound of subsets that is stronger than density. So what happens is that Brentano failed to understand this distinction, or never got to it in the first place. And this is maybe the crux of the issue, because it is with this new notion of continuity that is different from density that we have the creation of the different sizes of infinity with Cantor, and maybe the recognition of the true necessity of actual infinities. So I seem to be running out of time. So there are some other interesting ideas about the Brentanian conception, especially that relates to the notion of touching, and that idea that a boundary can be a boundary of two things at the same time. But we'll have to save that for another talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. So we'll now open to questions, our final round of questions. First, starting here with our researchers, if there are any questions to present to Arthur. Professor Ernesto, Professor Evandro, Professor Luis.
Okay, Ernesto, go ahead. Then I can.
Professor Ernesto, then Professor Evandro.
I have just your talk about Aristotle reminded me of some things I've read many decades ago. And for instance, I remember that when in the Middle Ages there was a discussion by the Latin averroists of the infinity and the creation in Aristotle. I don't remember who. I think it's Boetius of Dacia. He had an argument that was this way, and it touches the last point you just presented about the boundary being the end of a part and the beginning of another object. And the argument by Boetius of Dacia was, well, let's take the universe that is finite in Aristotle. It's a ball, let's say, and put a boundary around it. Well, the boundary is by definition the end of a part and the beginning of another part. So if we apply the notion of boundary to the universe, that implies that the universe is actually infinite. It implies, and well, they were condemned by the church for this. But do we have some discussion of this in Aristotle, or maybe in someone who came after Aristotle in the history of the continuum?
For sure. This is I think the main point in this whole discussion about the continuum, because so the way Brentano puts it, he is essentially reading the new characterization, the new point-set topological characterizations of continuum, and he says that there is this monstrous doctrine that claims that for two things to touch, you have to understand the boundary as being only the boundary of one of those things. Because so how you do it in set theory, right? So you have a region, right? And then you have the complement of that region, right? And one of them is open and one of them is closed. What does that mean? It means that one of them contains the boundary and the other one does not. And that has to happen, because if we're thinking about two regions that do not intersect, right? They cannot share the same boundary, because the intersection wouldn't be empty, would be the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the main question. Where does the boundary go? What happens to the boundary? Is the boundary a boundary of one thing or both things? And the way Brentano answers this question is very interesting, because he thinks that every extended object has a boundary. So the region and its complement both have a boundary. They're both closed in a sense. But Brentano recognizes that these boundaries, they might not be so full. Okay? So the idea is the following. If we have a ball and you divide that ball in two, you have the full disc, right? The pizza in the middle, right? And you take these two apart. And then you have to ask yourself, is this disc part of this hemisphere or this hemisphere? What Brentano says is no, because you divided the ball into these two hemispheres, they both have a boundary in the place of the disc. But what happens is that these boundaries are not full. They have what he calls half pleurosis, in the sense that they can coexist at the same point, right? Because they don't have a full being, they can coexist at the same point, right? And then this is essentially the Jordan curve theorem, right? It's the idea of the Jordan curve theorem, that you can always have, it always divides into these two regions, and they always connect exactly on that boundary. And he understands that if we have two regions that connect on the boundary, you can have half pleurosis. If we have three regions that connect to the boundary have a third pleurosis or something like that. So he introduces this notion that the boundary doesn't have to be so real in the sense of a substance. It can have less reality in a way, and that's how things can change. So there are a lot of things regarding the notion of boundaries and continuity. Is very interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so I believe we have a question by Professor Evandro.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Arthur. Very interesting work about Brentano. Yes, I think it's a little development from the Brentano student researches and from your dissertation. And we hope to see much more about this. I have a little question, two little questions. The first one, if you can expose something, okay, if you can say something about the suggestions that you put out in your text and in your exposition. Your suggestion put out to the fact that Brentano lacked a deeper understanding of the mathematics in his time. Okay, this is a position of Peter Simon. I think, yes, Brentano don't know enough mathematics, and Brentano don't care so much about mathematics. Okay, it's very interesting. But at the same time, you, in your exposition, indicate that Brentano's treatment of the problem of continuum seems to be limited by his own empiricism. Can we think about a solution of these 2 points together? Because it does look like that, or we accept some construction of mathematics that is not empiricist by one side, or it means that Brentano needs to give up the empiricist project, or maybe Simon Schur and you, Brentano had a big problem with mathematics, and this is a lack in his theory. This is my curiosity.
This remark I made, I believe it's true. I'm not saying that Brentano didn't know anything about mathematics of his time or anything. Exactly, these texts that eventually became published in the Time, Space, and Continuity volume, he's actually engaged in all this new mathematics and all these new things that are coming out in the science of his days, right? Of his day. So he's definitely paying attention to these developments, and he's reading Poincaré. Essentially, Poincaré is his connection to mathematics, right? And he's very interested, and he's actually he's so interested that he thinks he really needs to discuss with these mathematicians about things such as continuity, because they're simply taking it to thinking about these things in a way that is diverging from his Aristotelian assumptions, right? So he really cares about mathematics. That's my first point. But then there's a second point which I mentioned, and I mentioned in a way that is kind of sad, right? Because I wish that Brentano had understood this point, because it's a very crucial point for understanding, for empiricists in general, right? Is the idea that the real numbers have an infinity that is bigger than the infinity of the natural numbers, right? Because you can always cash out the infinity of the natural numbers in terms of potential infinity, right? It's always the idea that you have one more, and that's how we come up with the natural numbers. And so anything that that has this the same number of things than the natural numbers can be thought of in this way. So, for instance, the rational numbers, okay? But then when it comes to the real numbers, you have this jump, right? Because I don't know if everyone is familiar with this, but Cantor proved that the number of real numbers is strictly greater than the number of natural numbers, right? So in this way, we arrive at an infinity of a different level that cannot be interpreted anymore in terms of a potential infinity. Okay, so in this sense, I would love to hear what Brentano has to say about this, but he did not understand this point, and he still thinks about continuity in terms of infinite divisibility, which is precisely the characterization of the rational numbers that are not on the level of the real numbers. So,
oh, okay, interesting. But I have another curiosity. Maybe if you can say some words about the relation of proto-phenomenological ontology of the objects and the primary continua. If you are accept the idea that Brentano developed a mereological way to describe phenomena, then if you take the philosophy of Brentano in a progressive development of the mereological system, you believe that this relation, proto-phenomenological approach to ontology of object and this idea of primary continua is integrated, is a part of the systems of mereological description?
So here, I don't think Brentano is so much concerned with mereology. I think it's more it has more to do with topology, right? So because mereology just talks about parts and wholes, right? It's akin to, let's say, set theory, right? Where you have sets, there are subsets of other sets and stuff like that. Here we have an extra thing, right? Which is the notion of closeness or the notion of continuity, right? which one can be cashed out in terms of the other, right? And this is part of what we call topology, which is, let's say, a slightly stronger theory, because it has mereology, but it has more to it, okay? It requires mereology, but it has more to it. So, and the idea is that he does not want to recreate topology as an abstract mathematical science, right? Because what is topology as an abstract mathematical science? Well, it's just a few definitions of what it means to be a topology, right? It has to satisfy, it has to be a set of other sets that satisfy some properties and stuff like that. And then, given this abstract definition, we have instances, right? And one instance is what we can call, so you have many. If you take a look at my PhD in the third chapter, I have a section about this where I really go into the mathematical details of it, and I define a topology in a mathematical way, and I give examples of topologies, right? Because you can a topology is just a set of sets that satisfy some properties. Any set of sets that satisfies these properties is a topology, even if it's a crazy one. Okay, so sometimes you have the people give example of, say, the trivial topology. The trivial topology is just the empty set, right? So it's just a silly topology, let's say, right? But I want to make this distinction between the formal theory of topology, which studies what it is to be a topology, and then you have the particular topologies that fall under the theory, right? And what Brentano is trying to do is not to create a new theory of topology. He's trying to think about what is the most natural way to describe the topology of the things that are given in our intuition, okay? So this is the point where that I'm calling proto-phenomenological in a way, right? Because it's not about thinking about topology in general, it's about thinking about the specific topology of the primary continua, right? The things that are given to us in experience. So this is the connection.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. I think we don't have time for any more questions. So actually, there is one question from the audience, from our online audience. It's not actually a question; it's just I would say, a request. But if you could answer very briefly, Arthur, I will read it to you now. It's from Gabriel Lemos. He said, I would like to hear more about the justification of the real numbers and if it exists in the empirical sense. The way the real numbers are constructed is by demanding that very Cauchy sequence convert. Let me try to show you here. I don't think I can quite. There you go.
Is that the problem? Is not? It's not okay.
I don't know if we have time for if you can answer very briefly.
Yeah, there are the second part of the question above. Maybe Arthur can read in the commentaries of.
Yeah.
Can you read it, Arthur?
I'm reading it right now.
Yeah. So there is a second part.
Yeah. So
Arthur, if you can answer, I'm sorry, if you can answer very briefly because we're running out of time. So
yeah, I don't think I understand the question very much, but it's just that what I would like to say here is that yeah, of course, the number of things in a set is not the main thing for topology. We're trying to think about more properties than just the size of the set, right? This is, for that, set theory is sufficient, right? So topology, we have more things, more properties, especially the notion of closeness and everything. But what I was trying to say with the introduction of the rational numbers and how this is just, it's a bigger number than the number of natural numbers, is that by being a bigger number, than the natural numbers, you stop being able to understand these things in terms of a potential infinity. The size of the continuum essentially demands that we accept actual infinities. Okay, so that was my point. So we can talk a little bit more about this if you want. Thank you.
Okay, so any remaining questions and doubts, either from the audience or from our researchers, you can discuss it among yourselves later, and we can also forward the questions from the audience to our researchers after we finalize this event, which we now thank you, Professor Arthur, once more. Thank you for your talk, and I'd like to thank all our researchers and, of course, our online audience. I would request that you stay tuned to our social media to hear more about our upcoming events. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Evandro, who helped us organize this wonderful event. He has a few, he has a conclusion he would like to tell you. Your audio, Professor Evandro, your audio is closed.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone who attended our webinar, Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, Studies on Philosophy of Mathematics. And again, I'd like to thank you, the members of our Department of Philosophy in Unicentro, and the members of the group, researcher group of Origins of Philosophy Contemporary, Special Professor Mario Porta and Professor Celso Braida. And I need to thank the Araucaria Foundation to support our researchers here and in Unicentro. And finally, I would like, I have an invitation. I would like to invite our audience and to download the ebook of the same name of our webinar, Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, Studies on Philosophy of Math, which will be available on our researchers group website from next week. As well, the second invitation, I would like an invitation to download another book. Yeah, the book written by our colleague, Professor Luis Felipe, from his dissertation of PhD, Lógica e Ontologia na Lógica Pura do Jovem Russo. Thank you very much again, Julia, Arthur, and Ernesto. I hope, and Maria Luisa, of course, and I hope you can have an opportunity to realize the second edition of this seminar in the next semester. Okay, bye-bye.